Hello everybody, welcome to QI Talk Time. So today we're doing Liberating Structures, practical tools to energize, inspire and deliver frontline solutions. So I have Rob Cunny with me and I have Monisha Guidera with me here on the left. So hello to everybody and welcome. So I'm not going to go through both of these, but both of the speakers today are really experienced in frontline ownership techniques and liberating structures, and we're delighted to have them with us. So just some instructions. So just to try to keep it as interactive as possible, you can type in the chat box function on the right-hand side of the screen, and also there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. And please use @QI Talk Time on Twitter to keep the action going. So without further ado, I'll hand over to the guys.
Okay. Hey, well, good afternoon.
Hello.
So my name's Rob.
My name is Juanita. How are you? We hope that you'll find today's session really helpful. We're going to go through some of the work that we've been doing on liberating structures and in particular, enroll with their routine. Before we start, we would love to do a short poll. So we're going to see it coming up on your screens in a second. At least we hope that's going to happen. And we'd like you to select, just say A, B, or C. So A, you've used liberating structures before. B, you've participated in a liberating structure or technique, so somebody else has done it and you've participated. And C is that you're new to liberating structures completely. So we're just saying we're getting feedback here to say it mightn't be coming up just yet. So, oh, we have one answer already.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. This is the
technology, wonderful. So we just see, is it coming up here now?
Yeah, so you have to open poll to open it.
Right. There we go.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, brilliant. So we're going to let that run away there in the background. Is the poll coming up on the screen at the minute?
Yeah,
okay, so for 1 minute. So we're going to let that go for a second. And what we're going to do in the meantime is, while we're waiting for that to come through,
on the chat box. Click on the chat box.
There we go. Before we get into all of it, we just wanted to say a very special thanks to Dr. Michael Gardam and Leah Getterman, who first introduced us to liberating structures, and also then Henry and Keith, who are based in America, and they have been absolutely instrumental in terms of developing the liberating structures that we talk about and that we use today, and in particular making them available and accessible internationally for people around the world to use. They're a fantastic resource, and we've found them really helpful in our quality improvement work.
We should have the poll just coming to an end there now. We should be able to see the results. It just takes a bit of time to it just takes a little bit of time to sort of process, and the
like waiting for the jury, and we're going to have Bruce Pong coming in from Mayo or somewhere.
But it's good to see that, you know, just looking at the kind of the breakdown, it looks like most of the people who have replied have this is new to them or new to you guys, and we've some people who have participated in liberating structures before. So we're delighted. We've got lots of newbies, and so we hope that we'll be able to persuade you of the value of these techniques.
And what we'd say is when we get to the piece talking about our experience, if anybody has anything to add to it, just shout in as well. If you've got questions on ones that you're using or that you've seen used and you'd like to use them yourselves, just shout. So in terms of today, we're going to go through a little bit on the liberating structures and where they come from, and a little bit on complexity science, because all of the liberating structures are grounded in complexity science. And because we work in healthcare, that's really significant, because none of the problems, or very few of the problems in healthcare, are simple and straightforward because of the interdependencies. We're going to talk a little bit about why the work is important and how it can help you, and then give you some examples. And then we're going to try to do a live quiz, which will be the first time we've done it this way. So that'll be an interesting one.
Yeah. But people probably didn't realize that they were signing up to this, that they were going to try the very first online quiz
in Ireland ever. So just to say, in terms of the liberating structures, there are techniques that you can use to help engage and facilitate group conversations. And in particular, you'll see here on the left-hand side of the screen, they can be used to share or spread ideas, know-how, or experiences. reveal, generate, or improve ideas or solutions, analyze, diagnose, or brief. So if you've got a problem and you're trying to figure out where it's coming from or what it's about, you can help analyze it. Give or get help, so help colleagues to connect in with each other and support each other to identify solutions, strategize or plan. And there is a really good app, Liberating Structures app, that you can download from Google Play, and it's set up using these 6 headings. And whatever type of work you're trying to do, you can click on one of those headings and it will lead you into it. Separately then, there's the Liberating Structures website, liberatingstructures.com, and the 26 Liberating Structures that you see down on the right-hand side of the page are a number of the Liberating Structures on the site, and all of the instructions are there. So you don't need to be an expert to start using these, you just need a willingness to be able to go online and try it out. For us at the moment, I suppose, the idea behind it is that you can stimulate and unleash innovation. We have a hugely knowledgeable workforce in the health services. And when we talk to staff, a lot of them will say that very often they're not asked for their opinion. And if you're looking at any quality improvement or complaint in our system at the moment, if we talk to the staff in advance, they could have told us what the challenges were and what the problems were. So this is a really good way to tap into that knowledge and that expertise. And it also acknowledges the fact that people have different interests and different skill sets that you don't hear about in the day-to-day. And it gives you a chance to connect in with different people around your organisation that might have interest in an area that you're interested in, but you never get to talk to them about it normally. And the other idea behind it, it moves from that idea that we need to have permission to make changes, and it encourages anybody to get involved in quality improvement work. So, to give you a sense of the complexity of science behind it, I'm going to hand over to Rob.
So behind all of these liberating structures is that they are actually grounded in what's called complexity science, and sort of as a way into this, we just have another polling question for you, and let me just pull up the poll here. So the question that we want you to think about is to think about a project that you're currently working on. And do you think that this project is simple? Is it something that, when we talk about something that's simple, we mean a sort of something that is amenable to sort of a linear solution? So, you know, A will definitely lead to B. Is it complicated? Are there lots of layers and lots of formulas and that need to be lined up in order to get it to work? Is it complex? Is it a situation where you actually can't really predict what the outcome is going to look like, or indeed how you're going to get there? Or is it chaotic? You just have absolutely no idea what's going on. It just seems to be completely random. We'll just let people finish on that there. And so it's interesting that a lot of people, and I noticed somebody commented that the project should be simple. And the majority seem to have gone for complicated. So if we look at how we think healthcare works, we tend to think that things work in a linear fashion. It tends to be the way that we're taught, and it comes from the kind of the sort of mathematics and the sort of physical sciences. So you do A leads to B. If you do twice as much A, it'll lead to twice as much B. The reality is something happens that you might not be able to predict. It disappears into some sort of a black box and bounces around for a while, and ultimately you get the result that you were looking for. So I suppose that in a lot of healthcare, it's not so much like Star Trek. It's more like animals in the Muppet Show. And the liberating structures are a way of both techniques that you can use to find solutions within these complex environments, but at the same time, they also use the principles of complexity science to help you to achieve those. So I always like this quote from Harold Mencken: "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." And we frequently fall into the trap of trying to apply simple solutions or linear solutions to complex problems. And a lot of this comes down to the fact that when we look at a sort of a structure in, in healthcare or anywhere else, again, we tend to think in terms of silos and boxes and hierarchies. And so this is kind of, the kind of typical organizational structure that you might see in any organization. But the reality is messy. The reality looks more like this. And that, and in fact, I was just speaking to a colleague this morning who gave a great example of working on an improvement project where there was one individual who was constantly raising objections and causing problems, but through a social network involving two people who happened to work in the same company and knew this person, was able to tap into that and influence that person much more than they would have if they were simply following the simple sort of traditional hierarchical model. And one of the key principles that comes up in Liberating Structures is tapping into the wisdom of crowds, of tapping into these sort of social networks, and the fact that in a complex system, because you can't really predict where the solution is going to come from, the more people you can get involved and the more people you can get engaged and owning a problem, the more likely you are to find solutions. And I think, Juanita, I think you and I both found this, many times when you get a room full of people, it's amazing how the energy that's there, and how the solutions can come from the most unexpected of places. Once you provide people with these frameworks to allow sort of participation and ownership.
And some of that, I think, comes back to the fact that when you've got discipline-specific, you've been trained in a set way. So a lot of the time you approach a problem in the same way. So if you only got your peers or your own discipline looking at a particular challenge, then you don't get the diversity that's often needed to bring in that mix. And it's also tapping into beyond what we know as individuals in terms of our professional and what we bring to it from a personal perspective, because even if people in the same discipline who come from very different different backgrounds, different experiences, and that in itself leads to great conversations. And it can be very random conversations that can lead to the true answers and solutions that are going to really help you.
Yeah, I mean, Juanita and I, in fact, were doing a Liberating Structures user group meeting yesterday, and one of the people who was attending was talking about the particular situation where they work, where they're kind of involved in a very complex team divided over 3 different sites with lots and lots of different disciplines. That they were bemoaning this fact that there were, so many people involved, and Juanita and I were both thinking the same thing. All those people in the same room, you apply some Liberating Structures, you'd have such crack, because you would, because of that diversity, you would almost certainly find a lot of innovative solutions, and so we saw this as very much a positive. And it probably comes back to the fact that we tend to think in this way around sort of frontline ownership, and these are some principles that we really have to acknowledge Michael Garden and Dave Gilman in Toronto for bringing us to these. But there's a number of sort of principles that are applied when we're trying to promote frontline ownership. One is the idea sort of to go slow to go fast. So to take the time to identify who are the groups that you need to have involved, what matters to them, and putting the work into establishing those connections at the outset, inviting the unusual suspects. So they, again, not just thinking about the particular discipline, but thinking about getting everybody involved. So if you're trying to do an improvement project on something like let's say spread of infection in a hospital, don't just invite the infection control team, but get the doctors, the nurses, the physios, the cleaners, the patients, the parents, the porters. You know, the more people you get involved, the more interaction you get, the more likely you're going to find solutions.
Really good example that Michael and Leah used for that one is they were doing an end-of-life policy. So they asked for the, specialists in that area, so the consultant in palliative care, some of the nursing staff in that area, and they had 10 people around the table, and they said, it's not enough, we're not going to be able to develop a policy, with just this group of people. So they asked the question, and they put it out to the whole hospital, and they said, who's interested in having a good death? Now, probably a little bit physically insensitive in some ways, but they packed an auditorium because every other person had an interest in having a good death and wanted to say in how you would develop that policy. But it's the unusual suspect. And I think just going back very quickly to the go slow to go fast one, we're very hard on ourselves in healthcare, and there can be great progress along the way, but very often when you talk to teams, they don't recognize that it's progress. But sometimes getting 3 people in a room together, to have a basic conversation is a great win. So it's acknowledging the small things and knowing that it doesn't happen overnight. I think Oisin mentioned that it should be simple, it should be straightforward. But when you're trying to do change work or trying to do quality improvement work, it takes time, and there has to be that acknowledgement that it will, you go slow to go fast. When you get there and it gets moving, it really gets moving quickly.
There's actually a nice quote from Keith McCandless, who's one of the authors of the Liberating Structures website, where he basically says, in any change project or any project where you're trying to create improvement or you're trying to change behavior, you have to, at some point, involve those working on the front line, because they're the ones who are going to actually ultimately make the change. And you have a choice. You can either take the traditional route, which is, the group of experts sit in a room, write a guideline, and then tell people to implement it. So you can involve them the front line at the end, or you can involve the front line at the beginning. And that sometimes feels counterintuitive to us in healthcare because it takes a bit more time at the start. But ultimately, you will actually have a much greater chance of success. And I think also, you've already mentioned in terms of, inviting the unusual suspects, but also working with those who want to work with you, so working with the willing, like that example that Michael and Leah had from Toronto. Not sort of trying to force people into doing this, making clear that this is all voluntary. Nothing about me without me. So, if we're trying to run something and somebody says, it's all those damn, insert name of whatever discipline you want, get them in the room. Make that somebody's job to sort of say, okay, well, we're not going to talk about that group. We need them to participate. We need them to own this as well. And again, the fact that, that kind of complexity lens, the fact that it doesn't all have to go top down or bottom up. It can go top down, bottom up, sideways, all at the same time. Making the invisible visible, and I think this is one that we're going to come back to with the TRIZ, because Monique had some very nice examples from that. And this is also about participation, about actually getting people involved and acting things out as a way of changing mindset.
Okay. So in terms of, very quickly, we're going to go through this, maybe why some of this work is important and why this way of working is important. You might have seen the last staff survey, and in that it's told and said that 29% of staff were dissatisfied in their current job. A third intended to leave the organisation over the next 2 years. Only 29% believed the organisation was actually interested in their well-being, and only a third believed their managers listened to their ideas. Now, I don't think it's a small coincidence that a third people in the organisation don't feel listened to and a third of them want to leave. The challenge in a healthcare environment is very often we have staff members that might want to move to a different area but can't because they've got family commitments, they've got mortgages, they've an elderly parent, they've got kids in school. So what we end up with then is people working in systems that feel completely disengaged because they have no power or autonomy to change things that they're seeing day in, day out. And often the question isn't asked. And there can be very real reasons for that. One of the biggest pressures within the system at the moment is time. So where do you get the time to do this work? It all sounds lovely. It'd be brilliant to get everyone to do. We really want to do it, but how are we going to get the time for it? But the reality is we spend a lot of time fixing problems and fixing problems after they've happened. So if you think of how much time is spent dealing with complaints and incidents, And for serious complaints, how many levels and layers does it go through before it's fully resolved? And then you have the impact on staff. And you also then have things like data protection, freedom of information that take a lot of time. So in our work, we spend a lot of time figuring out workarounds for things that aren't perfect, as opposed to taking the time front up and trying to create solutions to these challenges that we're facing. And some of that comes back down to the conversations, the basic conversations with staff to say, what can we change, what can we do? And being realistic about it and being realistic about the expectations, because we won't necessarily change everything overnight. But if we were to change the top 3 things that staff wanted to work on, we would make a huge difference to their working environment. And all of this links back in then to the evidence around engagement. So when staff are engaged in their work, there's lower patient mortality, so less patients die, or service users have a better experience. There's reductions in the number of incidents, improvements in care, improvements, as I said, in experience, and staff well-being improves because you're less stressed because you spend less time fixing problems. Absenteeism drops, and then staff members start to stay. So we put a huge amount of time and effort within healthcare and into training and retraining staff members that are coming in, or with agency staff coming in at times. And some of that is about retention. So how can we retain our existing staff? How can we attract staff into our organizations? And if you have an environment where people can participate fully and can be part of the change, then the dynamic changes, and it makes a huge difference in terms of the day-to-day work. So this is the definition for engagement from the National Staff Engagement Forum. It's the mini organisation in the room. We mentioned it on the last QI Talk time on engagement. And it was the idea that when staff feel valued, emotionally connected, fully involved, enthusiastic, and are committed to providing a good service. And in particular, and this is probably the most important piece, when each person knows that what they do and say matters and makes a difference. There's something about being heard, and Liberating Structures provide an opportunity for staff to be heard on whatever project or topic that is of interest for your area. The other part, I suppose, of all of this is that idea that we have to have the conversations about what needs to change, because sometimes change can happen in the healthcare environment because there is an external push on. There's something that's topical at the minute. And sometimes we need to strip that back and say, what is going to help us most in our area? And as part of that conversation, there's a little piece that says, what's outside of our control? Because very often there are things that we can do nothing about. They're bigger than us at the moment. There might be some things in that, though, that we can influence. And then you have those things that are specific to us and specifically within our control range. And there is a conversation that says we need to challenge what we think is within our control, because very often when you're working in a healthcare environment, you can begin to take on the helplessness of the organisation that's around you, and that can impact on staff and how staff can become willing to take on things and willing to challenge. Or they've done it before and they haven't seen it go anywhere. So there needs to be that commitment that we're going to start the conversation, we're going to finish the conversation. But there's an estimated 15% that we can control, and there's a liberating structure called 15% solutions, which is a really good one, and it's to say we're going to start with the things we can control, and we're going to take it and we're going to work on those, and then everything else will influence, and we might seek to change over time, but at the minute we're going to focus on what we can control right now. And there's a sense of power then that comes with that from a staff perspective. And the idea is when you're in a system with the same people, the same structures, the same incentives, there's nobody going to come with a big bonus, for this. There is a huge sense of pride in it, but there isn't a bonus. We need to change the processes and patterns of how we relate to each other, because very often the complexity in healthcare comes from the fact that we have lots of different teams that interact to get a solution. And a lot of our service users are coming into the system and they don't have the broken arm in isolation. You can have a patient with a broken arm who also has Alzheimer's, who also has diabetes, and how do all of those teams connect to look after that particular person? Or we both the community, mental health, and acute setting. So how we do the process piece, the liberating structures again, will help with that. So we're very conscious that we've talked a lot about liberating structures, but haven't gotten into the meat of what they are. So we're going to have a chat very quickly about some of the work that we've done using liberating structures.
Yeah.
Pass over to Rob.
So we've used liberating structures in a variety of settings. And we do a sort of a monthly Liberating Structures user group. It's usually held on the first Monday of the month here in Dr. Stevens. We've used them in, when we've used them a lot in staff engagement sessions in various places around the country. I've used them in quite a bit in Temple Street, and I think one of the things that I think from the kind of the photos that we have of using these, for example, the one down the bottom left-hand corner, that's a group of NCHDs in Temple Street at their induction day, where we used a very simple liberating structure called speed networking to get them to identify ways to improve hand hygiene at the hospital. And in the space of about 6 to 8 minutes, we had a whole room full of people discussing this, and you could feel just the energy and the noise in the room, because suddenly people were being asked for their opinion, and we got some really, really clever ideas of improvement processes that we could do. And I suppose one of the things that you don't get from these photos is that sense of the energy in the room when you use these systems. Or when you use these liberating structures, and there's a big sort of variety of them. Including in the top left, you can see is one that's based on improvised scenes, and in case you're concerned, that is one of our colleagues pretending to be a patient who has collapsed on the floor, and there's a whole menu of techniques that you can use to unlock people and to really get people engaged, depending on the particular problem or scenario that you're dealing with.
Just to give a quick example, as Rob said, we use speed networking, or impromptu networking as it's called, as the official title. A few people in Ireland have referred to it as speed dating, and we always say we want to be invited to any weddings that come out of it. But the idea is that you think of a question that you want to ask the group, and you will always have what's your name, where are you from, and what's your particular question. And then you ask the group to randomly find somebody that they haven't spoken to yet, and everybody stands up for this because it automatically changes the energy. They find somebody they haven't spoken to yet, and 2 people have a conversation, 1 minute per person. And then you call switch, they switch around, they find somebody else, and you might do this 3 times. And then you can get the group back together, and you can have a conversation with the group about, well, what came out of it, what are your expectations for today, what was the change that you wanted to see happen, whatever your question is. But what it does is that it gets people talking, and gets them talking very often early in a session. And in doing that, then by the time it comes to the coffee break, if you're doing a piece of work, or if you've got a team that doesn't necessarily interact well, or is just getting to know each other, it's a good time to do it early in the session, because when it comes to that tea break, or they pass each other in the hallway later on, because they've said hello and they've had an initial conversation, it's very hard to ignore that person subsequently, and it leads then to greater conversations about things that we have an interest in. And that's the impromptu networking. Another gateway one that we would use a lot. So you'll see here on the top right-hand side, we have the National Staff Engagement Forum, and we use principles of frontline ownership and organisational development as the fundamentals as to how that could work. So we would use a liberating structure called 1, 2, 4, all, and again, it's another gateway, very easy to use, anybody can use it. And the idea is that, again, you take a minute in silence, and people will write down their answer to whatever question you've posed. Okay, and that minute in silence is really important, because it gives the introverts in a room an opportunity to think about what they're going to say. Because you know yourself, if you've got 20 people sitting around the table, the extrovert will very often be the first to speak, while the introvert is still thinking about what is the question or what do I want to do. And it's about acknowledging that people have different ways of engaging. So in taking that minute, it gives people that quiet time to do that. And then again, similar to speed networking, 2 people will have a conversation, except this time those 2 people join another 2, and they have another conversation as a group of 4, and they have a minute each to share their response. And then finally you can take feedback from the full group. But it's a really good way to surface the ideas that people have, and in particular when we do have big groups that are working, it can be quite challenging to get what are people really feeling and what are they thinking. But it can also work for teamwork. Do you want to talk about big
I mean, I think as Manisha said that there are certain ones that we tend to use a lot as kind of the gateway liberating structures, particularly the speed networking, 124all and TRIZ, because they're ones that very quickly get people engaged, get people talking, get people interacting. And depending on the type of issue or type of situation you're dealing with, sometimes just one of those can be enough. So I think an example of a large committee in Temple Street, where our last meeting, we did speed networking, took us about 8 minutes. And in that 8 minutes, we managed to fill a whole flip chart full of ideas for improvement and to distill it down to 12 possible tests of change that we're going to experiment with over our subsequent meetings. But the other thing with that meeting, which previously had been a meeting that used to sort of struggle to finish within 2 hours, the whole meeting was done in an hour, and every single person around the table at the big committee, every single person contributed at the meeting. So sometimes just a single liberating structure like that can be enough to, if you just focus on one particular issue. But what you can also do is you can string them together. So you can use something like the speed networking to get people engaged initially, but then you can use other ones like there's one called Agreement Certainty Matrix, which is very good for answering the question that we asked on the polling question about, is your problem as simple, is it complicated, complex, or chaotic? And then depending on that, you can then use other liberating structures and say, well, let's look at the complicated one, or let's look at the complex one and see how can we find the top solutions that will work for that.
There is another one that's really good in healthcare, because we have a lot of policies and a lot of things that come often nationally, or we're trying to work on different projects in different areas with different culture. And the question always comes up, does the same policy apply in the exact same way everywhere? So one of the liberating structures is to look at minimum specifications. So if we were introducing a hand hygiene piece across the whole organisation, what are our minimum specifications? What are those things that everybody agrees on? So you identify what are our minimum specifications. But then how you go about implementing it after that is completely up to each individual site. And that's really important, because you have different personalities, different ways of working, different ideas across an organisation, even within an organisation. And when you have that leeway and that latitude and autonomy to do a certain amount of things yourself and put your own stamp on it, sometimes things can improve. And you can be better than the minimum specification, or you know what I mean, or you can have a different idea that will revolutionise it, or you find a way of working within the constraints that are in your area. Yeah. And there is something in all of this work about recognising where people are at and what's going on in that particular organisation at a time, because each one is different and one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes back to this recognition that we're working in complex environments, and one example, I mean, you give the example of hand hygiene. I mean, that's what we've done in Temple Street, is that, each ward has essentially taken a different approach in terms of how they have delivered improvements in hand hygiene. There are certain key principles, those minimum specifications or the non-negotiables that everybody agrees on. Yes, we're going to do, we're going to follow the sort of the WHO recommendations. We're all going to measure what we're doing and so forth. But outside of that, the way in which those are delivered varies incredibly just from one ward to another in one hospital, because even at that level, you're still dealing with a different culture in each ward. So by accepting that and recognizing that at the outset, you have a much greater chance of success than trying to say, no, we're going to come up with a big complicated guideline and tell everybody you've got to follow this to the letter.
Yeah, and there is a piece as well. So we did a lot of this work. We started off in University Hospital Kerry, and the case study is up on the website staffengagement.ie if you're looking for an example. But they ended up with 5 groups working on communication, culture, waste, flexible working and training and education. And they tried one of the liberating structures, and they did something revolutionary in an area, and they moved all of the tables in the canteen because they wanted to introduce Happy Mondays. And the feedback was for people, don't do that. We want to go in and have our break at that particular table on that particular time. So there is a piece about testing this stuff. So they changed it and maybe something else, which was really successful and worked. But there is a piece about testing it and not being afraid of going pear-shaped, because sometimes it does. But it is about testing, seeing how it goes, and finding what works for your area.
Yeah. So we thought we would let everybody actually experience a liberating structure, and so we're going to do something called TRIZ. And TRIZ is essentially where we try to design the opposite. We'll explain in a moment where this comes from. But here's your challenge. We want you to, using the chat box, we want you to come up with ideas of how would you ensure that wherever you are based, wherever you're working, every quality improvement project fails. And not doesn't just fail, but really fail. I mean, just absolutely crashes and burns with drastic results. We want you to be as creative, imaginative as you can in terms of coming up with ideas of how would you deliver this? How would you deliver the worst possible quality improvement situation? So over to you guys, and then we'll see what we come up with. Okay, we've got some good ones coming through already. So just a reminder, folks, to click on the little chat button at the top, just so you can see the chat box.
Do it all yourself. Can you see if we look at these? Yeah. Which is going to help with the technology
here, so we just go into the chat.
Oh, great.
Scroll up and down there.
So I think we can.
Yeah. Sounds like you might have some experience in quality improvement.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got some great ideas there. So if we run back through some of them here, so you know, don't talk to anyone about it. Don't take any feedback. Require sort of management team approval for every idea before it starts. Ignore patients. Don't start it in the first place. Ignore staff. Do it all yourself. Not knowing what it is you're trying to change, imposing change without consultation, involving no one. Don't make any measurements. Make sure nobody is aware. So you can see there's sort of common themes coming through. Not having the right people involved, no staff engagement, and start a rumor is the opposite to what's happening. So the thing is that normally when we do this with, and I've done it with sort of groups of, I've done it with groups of dentists, for example. We ask the question, how do you guarantee that every patient who comes into you gets put on an inappropriate antibiotic? I've done similar things with GPs, I know, Juanita, you've got lots of examples around, using this in terms of staff engagement as well. I think that what people come up with all these sort of crazy ideas of how not to do something, and
do you want to go through some of that list and finish it out?
So the idea here is, as I say, it's based on this Russian engineering principle of where, if you want to, for example, design a bridge, you start by saying, how do we design the bridge so we can guarantee it's going to fall down? And so if you're a design engineer, that then allows you to sort of say, okay, hang on a second, we need to really focus on these bits because these are the bits that could fail. And so the principle here is trying to identify all of the ways that things could go wrong. And so what tends to happen is people come up with all these great suggestions of, of how not to do something. But the second step in a TRIZ is then to ask, do any of these things actually happen? Do we have situations where, where people don't measure what they're doing in quality improvement? Yes. Do we have situations where people just are not informed that there's a quality improvement process going on, where people have to wait for permission, or the flip side of that, they don't tell management or don't get management involved, or don't have staff engagement? And I think most of us, if we go down through that list, will recognize that actually these things do happen. They really don't happen all of the time, but at least they happen some of the time. So, it's often a way of not just sort of identifying the things that happen, but it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about making the invisible visible. And if you're going to share your sort of experience with
we would do this. So the next step, as Rob said, is we go through this list and we put it through the rapid fire buzz around, and we'll go through and we'll see, are any of these things happening or at the minute? And there would be a piece where, you'd be able to have that conversation to say, do we ignore staff? At the minute, yes, we do. Do we do it all ourselves? At the moment, yes, we do. And what you have then is you've got a list of things that we're actually doing at the moment. All those negative behaviours that we've said were the worst possible case scenario are all things that we're doing at the minute. And then we go through the list again and we say, well, what can we control on it? So what is on that list at the minute that we have direct control over as an individual? And then you look and say, okay, I haven't got control on that, but I can influence it. And that's where your 15% solution comes in. So with something like the TRIZ, what it does is it names those negative behaviours. So we would do it for, say, staff engagement. And you put up all of those terrible, awful behaviours. So we're not going to let anybody go on a break time. We're going to make sure every staff member is bullied. We're going to make sure that nobody gets to go on holidays. We're going to make sure people don't get paid on time. And then you go through the list, and there's a sudden dawning in the room that each of those things can happen in a small way within our work environment. And staff aren't getting to go on their break. And they're not getting to take their holidays because we don't have cover for them. And there might be bullying happening. But if we were to go in and have an initial conversation with people to say, how would we improve staff engagement? Those negative behaviours don't get named as simply. But because they're now on that list, we have a license and an opportunity to talk about them. So where you see it, another example would be for falls prevention. And there's some really good stuff coming up around that, like so we'll make sure that everything is just a little bit out of reach, or we'll release small dogs into the wards. Now, we might release small dogs into the wards, but we will have hazards that people will fall over that will be the equivalent of the small dog on the ward.
I have to interrupt here. Someone has typed in to Anita, don't give anyone sweets.
Poppy, is that you? So you have all of these behaviours that it's just, we can name the negatives in the room. It's always good to give people chocolate, but you have to mention that they take responsibility on a personal level for diabetes or bad teeth. So what I would say to you is with the TRIZ, it's a really good way. The most important thing if you're going to do a TRIZ with people is that you allow the time on the opposite side of it so that you can have a conversation about how we are going to work on the solutions. Because if you don't, suddenly you've got all these negative behaviours on a list and people get very depressed. So it's really important that you build in the time to look and say, how are we going to work on the solutions? And the 1, 2, 4, or liberating structure we mentioned is a really good way to have that conversation. So that is the sort of the whistle-stop tour of the TRIZ.
Yeah, and I suppose just to we need to think about they often link this into the kind of the 15% solution. And sometimes when you say to people that the most that any one person can influence the system, or can, at least in a complex system, is about 15%. At first glance, that might seem a bit depressing, but then you realize, well, no, actually, that means I don't have to worry about the other 85%. If I can just identify, and maybe I can't influence 15%, maybe I can only influence 5%. But you get enough people in the room, you get enough of the unusual suspects, and somebody can contribute 5%, somebody can contribute 10%, somebody else another 10, and it's way up to 15. And you realize that if you put all of these together, it comes up to 100%. You know, when certainly I know when I've used the TRIZ before, where I recently did it with a GP meeting in relation to managing infections in nursing homes. And at the very end, what we did was we said, okay, out of all of these things that came up on the list, is there something that you can change on Monday morning when you go back to the nursing home? And we managed to get a commitment from all the GPs in the room that there were sort of narrowed it down to sort of 2 or 3 things that they were saying, yeah, that I can actually, I can't necessarily fix it, but I can certainly improve it, and I can start to improve it on Monday morning. And this is where these, you know, the TRIZ and other liberating structures can be so powerful, because it unlocks or unleashes those possibilities that people didn't realize were there.
And it gives you an opportunity for the conversation about the blocks that might be there to that. But they're hugely powerful, and they're a great way as well for colleagues to build up a rapport and to get to know each other in a different way, because very often we work in silos and we don't get that chance to talk to people. Now, you don't have to use liberating structures either. You can sit down over a cup of tea in an informal setting. The most important thing is that you start to have the conversation, but the liberating structures do give you a different way, and they change the energy in the room, because people are generally moving, or they're getting to talk to people that are outside of their usual.
Yeah, so as I said, that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. We would, so I don't know if anybody has any questions, but we just point out that there's, we've mentioned a couple of sort of good sort of resources. Definitely take a look at the Liberating Structures website. There is a book as well, as Juanita also mentioned. There's a free app which has all of the structures on it. If you want to try these out, if you want any help or support for these, please get in touch with either of us. We do, they run Liberating Structures user group every month here in Dr. Stevens. People are more than welcome to come along.
And if it's a thing that you can't get to Dublin for that meeting, if you want to set up one locally and get a group together where you're going to practice these, pick up the phone and talk to us, because we can give you some suggestions on how to go about doing that. The staffengagement.ie website has, you know, examples of this. It also will have details of upcoming training. So we just recently did an introductory training session, and in the new year we'll be doing more introductory sessions and an advanced session for people that are using it regularly. And just, yeah, pick up the phone and talk to us if you think that'd be helpful. But the instructions are all there, and it's just about getting started. And once you start, your confidence begins to build, and you'll start to do them more and more regularly.
So thanks a million, Juanita and Rob. There's actually no questions that come in, so it obviously was so clear to everybody. So thank you so much. But just 1 or 2 things from me. So say, for example, using your frontline ownership techniques to get loads of feedback and loads of ideas, and you're bombarded with things to do and options. How do you then decide where to go with it if it's challenging to get agreement at that point?
So, so again, this is where there's a couple of sort of specific liberating structures that, so the, you know, one is as I mentioned, is the agreement certainty matrix, which is where you try and map, you know, particular issues or problems with, you know, how certain are we that we know what the outcome should be or how to get to that outcome, and how much agreement is there amongst all the people who are involved. And depending on where it is, where it comes on that matrix, you can then sort of say, okay, for this, you know, if we've got a situation where there's a high degree of certainty about what the outcome should be, but there's not a lot of agreement within the wider group of how to get there. That's where the kind of things like the social network mapping and the kind of liberating structures that are based on establishing connections between people can be the kind of the more sort of social aspect of it. Whereas if it's a problem that requires more of sort of coming up with innovative solutions, because you don't really, if more in that complex realm, that's where things like TRIZ or Wise Crowds, which is another favorite of ours, can be really useful.
One thing we found helpful when we started off our listening sessions, it took 4 months to do the first report because we had hundreds of ideas. So one of the things that we looked at doing was using the crowdsourcing liberating structure. So it's 2510, and it's an effective way to help surface those great ideas that are within the team and give you a place to start from, because the group self-selects what they want to work on. And Rob has a really good way of measuring that if anyone is interested, based on the Father Ted principles of measurement. so let us know if you want that. But it's a really good way to do that. And it's one of those ones that's quite easy to use, but it can seem quite broad to start off with, but it can be helpful to narrow down there if you've got a lot of ideas. The other thing as well is basically having a conversation to say we're not going to be able to do everything. So one of the things we're going to have to do as a group, very frankly, is take one of the top things you want to work on, so that you're managing the expectations, and that from a leadership perspective, that people, in senior roles don't feel completely challenged, and there is that opportunity for discourse and conversation about, well, we tried that before, or that didn't work, or we can't do it for whatever reason, so that you have that openness and that willingness to have that conversation. And if you do that, then you'll have really meaningful engagement.
And just one other thing, I suppose, just to ensure or reassure the listeners that you don't have to have experience. There's all these techniques, and it's about enjoying them and trying them out, isn't it? And trying to sampling them and see what works for you. So one of the things just to highlight again is the Liberating Structures user group, which happens.
It's usually
when the next one is happening, or
so it's usually the first Monday of the month, but we're thinking of experimenting with sort of different days for next year. So, but there will be one. It probably won't be the first week of January, but it'll be sort of the.
And that's a good way of practicing and trying them out, getting confident.
If you're on Twitter, we have an @LSUsers Twitter handle that you can follow some of this work on, or you can follow Rob and myself, and you'll get updates as to when things are, when events are on. But the @LSUsers handle has all of this details and things as they come up. Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much.
So we have Juanita's and Rob's contact details here, so you can definitely, as I said, contact them if you have any queries or want some more information for a local session. Also, if you go onto the website, which we've talked about throughout, and we put them in the chat box, you'll get some more information there. And just to highlight some other things, the Framework for Improving Quality and the Improvement Knowledge and Skills Guide is part of the Quality Improvement Division's recent publications, so you can go onto that website there at the bottom. And then just lastly then, for all our QI Talk timers out there, thanks a million for joining, and I just want to again acknowledge Rob and Juanita's great conversation.
At LSUsers.
Users, LSUsers.
We're just typing in the Twitter handle into the chat box, So just thanks again to our experts, Rob and Juanita, for giving us their time today, and hopefully we might even have a follow-up session with one or two other techniques next year. So our next session is with Dr. Michael Carton on the 19th of December, so Tuesday the 19th of December at 1 p.m, and it's on Run Charts for Improvement. And again, you can email us if you want us to be added to the mail list, or you can follow us on Twitter at QI Talk Time. And thanks a million again for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you.